Good morning. My name is Dwight Bashir, and I serve as Director of Outreach and Policy at the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, also known as USCIRF. For those not familiar, USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan U.S. federal government body created by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, or IRFA, to monitor religious freedom abroad and to make policy recommendations to the President, Secretary of State, and United States Congress. Thank you for joining us for our event today on the Global Compact on Refugees. The legislation that created us contains several provisions related to asylum seekers and refugees, including individuals who have fled severe violations of religious freedom. Since our creation, USCIRF has monitored the implementation of these provisions, paying special attention to the plight of those displaced due to religious persecution. Unfortunately, this work is more important than ever. The scale of the global refugee crisis is unprecedented. Nearly 80 million people are displaced worldwide, with the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, estimating that 26 million are considered refugees, including those that have fled their home countries due to religious persecution. Given these immense numbers, the Global Compact on Refugees, or GCR, endorsed by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 2018, is designed to strengthen the international response to large movements of refugees and protracted refugee situations by promoting responsibility sharing among host countries and communities. I'm joined today by USCIRF Chair Nadine Mayenza and Commissioner Anurima Bhargava, who will share some of the U.S. government's recent pledges in line with the GCR and highlight USCIRF's relevant policy recommendations. We will then hear from our panelists, Rabbi Jacobs, a member of the joint UNHCR Religions for Peace Multi-Religious Council of Leaders, and Patrick Wall, author of a recent report that assessed progress on the Compact's objectives and commitments. Our panelists will provide insight into the GCR and how it has supported refugees fleeing religious persecution and share recommendations to improve its implementation moving forward. I'll then moderate a conversation among the speakers with some opening questions, but there will be time for questions from the audience as well. Now, to ask a question, please use the Zoom webinar's Q&A function at the bottom center of your screen to submit your question in writing, which you can do at any time during the event starting right now. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to USCIRF Chair Nadine Mayenza.
Thank you, Dwight. I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to our distinguished guests for taking the time to speak with us today about the Global Refugee Compact. While a non-binding international framework, the Compact represents a significant demonstration of solidarity and commitment among the international community to better protect and support refugees and host communities. Recognizing that addressing the global refugee crisis requires international cooperation, the GCR outlines actions to promote equitable responsibility sharing by donor countries, host countries, and countries that are not typically engaged on refugee issues, along with other relevant stakeholders. Our panelists today will explain the GCR in more detail, and I look forward to learning more about this significant initiative. This conversation is particularly timely as the Biden administration just participated in the UNHCR's high-level officials meeting in December to discuss progress and challenges in implementing the GCR. At this meeting, U.S. government announced several pledges, including committing to increasing resettlement in the United States and complementary pathways. Last year, USCIRF applauded the Biden administration for committing to welcoming up to 125,000 refugees through the U.S. Refugee Admissions program for fiscal year 2022. The Biden administration also committed to launching a private sponsorship pilot program that will allow private individuals and organizations in the United States to support refugees resettling here. Relatedly, the Biden administration pledged to establish new public-private partnerships to support the rapid resettlement of Afghans in the United States. We welcome this initiative and hope that these partnerships will prioritize the resettlement of Afghans at severe risk of persecution based on their religion or belief. In this vein, we have called on the State Department to expand its Priority 2 designation, granting the U.S. refugee program access for certain Afghan nationals and their family members to explicitly include members of Afghan religious minorities in recognition of the severe risk of persecution they face from the Taliban. At the UNHCR meeting, the Biden administration made several commitments related to increasing refugee participation and self-reliance, two pillars of the compact. The United States government included, for the first time, a refugee advisor and its delegation, and committed to continuing to support efforts to include refugees and representatives of host communities in relevant international fora. The Biden administration also promised to work to ensure meaningful refugee participation in the implementation of humanitarian assistance. The United States set a goal of working with partners to reach 250,000 refugees with self-reliance programming in at least 5 countries. I'll turn to my colleague, Commissioner Bargava, to discuss other actions by the Biden administration and our recommendations for how the U.S. government can support these vulnerable populations.
Thank you, Chair Manza, and I would like to reiterate our gratitude to our panelists for joining us today. These pledges that Chair Manza outlined are significant and demonstrate the Biden administration's commitment to supporting refugees. However, as we explored at our February 2021 hearing on refugees fleeing religious persecution, there is still much work to be done. During the Trump administration, the U.S. refugee admissions target plunged from its average level of 95,000 annually to a historic low of 15,000. As a result of this reduction in the overall number of refugees admitted to the United States, only a small number of persecuted religious minorities were able to access the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. As the Biden administration rebuilds and reforms the program, working towards the goal of admitting 125,000 refugees this fiscal year, we urge the administration to pay due attention to resettlement survivors of the most egregious forms of religious persecution, including Iranian religious minorities eligible for processing under the Lautenberg Amendment, members of other severely persecuted religious or belief communities, and survivors of genocide or other atrocity crimes. The U.S. Refugee Admissions Program is a critical pathway to offer haven to those who are in harm's way, but ultimately, only a small fraction of the world's refugees will be resettled in third countries. That is why the Compact's goals of aiding host countries and supporting refugee self-reliance are so important. To support these objectives, we also urge the Biden administration to continue to provide overseas assistance to displaced populations and the communities hosting them, and work to create conditions that would ultimately allow refugees to return home. The Compact principles apply both internationally and domestically, which means that all countries must ensure that their own domestic processes protect refugees. IRFA authorized USCIRF to examine whether the US government's own treatment of asylum seekers in the expedited removal process was being implemented in a manner consistent with the United States obligations to protect individuals fleeing persecution. USCIRF has issued a series of reports on expedited removal that documented major problems that successive administrations have yet to address. The expanded use of the expedited removal process and the placement of asylum seekers in immigration detention facilities, coupled with other measures, have raised additional concerns about the protections the United States have afforded to those fleeing religious and other forms of persecution who arrive at our country's borders. We have urged the Biden administration to address these longstanding flaws by enhancing the quality and oversight of the initial processing of non-citizens, improving detention conditions, and appointing a high-level official at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to coordinate and oversee reforms. These improvements would not only advance the protection of asylum seekers in the expedited removal process, but also further the United States commitments under the Compact. Thank you again to our panelists for joining us, and I look forward to our discussion here today. We'll start with Rabbi Jacobs. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. For the UNHCR and for Religions for Peace, on whose joint 18-person multi-religious council of leaders I'm honored to serve, a council intended to shape the religious community strategies on the Global Compact on Refugees. For so many countries across the globe buffeted by the unprecedented levels of over 80 million displaced people and by forced migration and refugee challenges, for all those who have fled their countries in the face of religious persecution and violence, for all those religious communities who provide vital material, social, and spiritual services to refugee communities, and who often provide a prophetic voice to their governments and the people of their nations on behalf of the rights and opportunities to which all refugees are entitled. To all these, the Global Compact on Refugees was a milestone of enormous potential and hope if we all government and NGOs alike, including the faith communities, do our work right in these next years, it will turn out to be a milestone of enormous impact. Let me add, as a rabbi who serves as the president of the largest Jewish denomination in North America, how deeply committed is the Jewish community, including our Reform Jewish movement, in advocating for America to uphold its best traditions of supporting refugees, traditions that brought safety to millions of Jews fleeing persecution. These periods of open welcome, represented by Emma Lazarus's words on the Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, offered us shelter and hope in a land that has provided Jews more rights, more freedoms, more opportunities than we have ever known in diaspora Jewish life. The biblical command that the migrant who sojourns with you shall be to you as your citizens remains a constant goad to our community and to so many other religious communities. Since the 1920s, Jewish national agencies, often led by the extraordinary work of HIAS, have fought for more generous and welcoming policies by our government and have opened the doors of our synagogues and communal institutions to assist with refugee settlement. In my own movement, our Krauss Family Initiative, of which I am so proud, launched in the face of regressive immigration policies of the last administration, helped mobilize our network of 850 congregations across North America in taking up the work of fighting for immigrants and refugee justice, and supporting those who have recently arrived at our shores. So too the response from almost every faith group in our nation. For Jews, this cause has special resonance. From Egypt through the Holocaust until today, Jews have been perhaps the quintessential immigrant refugee community, victims of religious persecution throughout millennia. Time and again, we were banished, exiled, ethnically cleansed by various oppressors, forced to flee to other lands, seeking safety for our families, security for our communities, the opportunity to build Jewish life and contribute to the surrounding societies. You all know the general outlines of the crisis in the world today. Over 84 million displaced people, 26.6 million refugees, 4.4 million asylum seekers. Of the displaced populations, nearly 17 million come from just 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, including, of course, the nearly million ethnically cleansed Rohingya. With the exception of Venezuela, the other 4 countries contain significant populations of those displaced who have been victims of religious persecutions and violence. Add to the victims from ISIS's genocidal violence against religious minorities in Iraq, of Boko Haram's targeting primarily Christian communities in Nigeria and surrounding lake countries, the plight of the Uyghurs and Tibetan Buddhists in China, Muslims in India. All these and more religious communities, almost everywhere the victims are minority religious communities in their region or nation. They've experienced periods of ethnic cleansing, of forced migration, or flight from persecution. We know the forces that drive these displaced populations, not just ethnic and religious hatred, but human rights abuses and repression in the face of growing authoritarianism, economic despair, climate change, and COVID. As these trends intensified over the last decade, a key response of the international community was the GCR. You know the key components of the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, which in turn led the groundwork for the Global Compact. Reaffirmed obligations to fully respect the human rights of refugees and migrants, pledged robust support to those countries affected by large movements of refugees and migrants, underlined the centrality of international cooperation to the refugee protection regime, recognized the burdens that large movements of refugees placed on national resources, especially in the case of developing countries, and called for educational services to children. The Refugee Compact is focused on enhancing more predictable and equitable responsibility sharing when it comes to large-scale refugee movements and protracted displacement. It seeks to prevent displacement where possible, respond more effectively when people are displaced, and find solutions for those who need protection, including by supporting conditions for return and expanding access to resettlement and other protection pathways. In so doing, it seeks to affirm 4 major goals. 1, ease pressures on host countries. 2, enhance refugee self-reliance. 3, expand access to third country solutions. 4, support conditions in countries of origin for return in safety and dignity. And all this speaks directly to USCIRF's responsibilities and fulfillment of its role as a watchdog of America's efforts on behalf of religious freedom and against religious discrimination and persecution everywhere. Its role is to provide guidance to all arms of the US government how to do this work more effectively. From the beginning, you have had a special concern for the plight of forced migrants, especially those who are victims of religious persecution. And I commend you for that focus, as I do for your important hearing just a year ago on ways the US government can better protect and support individuals fleeing religious persecution through the US Refugee Resettlement Program, the US asylum system, and overseas assistance. I was encouraged that this US administration has been acting assertively to implement the Global Compact on Refugees. And the vision of the GCR cannot be fulfilled unless the vision of USCIRF's mission is fulfilled, the ability of all to live with religious freedom. Hence the importance of our conversation this morning. For if millions are subject to restrictions on their religious freedom or are victims of religious persecution, more will migrate in their efforts to find refuge where they can peacefully practice their religion and worship God in accordance with their conscience. If those who are ethnically cleansed or who are forced migrants for other reasons cannot live freely in their country of refuge, that too will lead to instability in their host nation and result in further migration. If the religious communities of either the original nation or the host nation do not have the right to live freely, nor to fulfill their obligations to serve their fellow human beings, this too will lead to instability and result in wasteful constraints on the enormous social capital contributions that religious communities can and do make to education, to healthcare provision, or refugee services across the globe. And as I suspect you will hear from my distinguished colleague who will speak in a moment, the implementation of the Global Compact has been uneven. The successful implementation of the Refugee Compact is not up to states alone. It's up to all of us, especially faith-based organizations. FBOs, churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, and faith-based charity and mutual assistance organizations are already on the ground, ready to receive forcibly displaced persons when they arrive or while they are in flight. FBOs also remain with refugees and asylum seekers after international NGOs leave the scene, when the funding dries up or when fatigue sets in. Finally, for many refugees, regardless of the reason for their flight, one of the few things the authorities can't take away from them is their spirituality. Faith-based organizations, FBOs, whether of the same faith or not, are in the best position to approach refugees with faith sensitivity, as all NGOs, UN and government actors should do. The important thing for an organization to serve refugees effectively is not whether they are faith-based, but whether they are faith sensitive as a key component for refugee resilience is their faith. In the end, vigorous implementation of the Global Compact will strengthen religious freedom, and free religious groups and voices can help the Refugee Compact fulfill its potential. And that is what makes this conversation this morning so essential. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Jacobs, for those remarks. And I'd like to turn it over to Patrick Wall now. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Bashir, and my thanks also to Chair Menza and Commissioner Bhargava and the Commission staff for inviting me to participate in this discussion today, and in particular to Rabbi Jacobs for your eloquent and passionate remarks. My name is Patrick Wall. I'm an independent consultant based in Geneva in Switzerland. And until recently, I worked at UNHCR on the development and implementation of the Global Compact on refugees. And a number of my ongoing projects as a consultant also relate to the implementation of the Compact. As we've heard, the global displacement situation continues to deteriorate, and COVID-19 has only made things worse. In the developed countries of North America and Europe, it's easy to overlook the fact that the vast majority, 86% in fact, of the world's refugees are currently living in developing countries that faced enormous socioeconomic and other challenges before the refugees arrived. It is also, though, important to put this so-called refugee crisis in its proper context. This is a crisis for the people who have been displaced and separated from their families. It is a crisis for countries like Lebanon, where 1 in every 8 people is a refugee, as compared with 1 in every 400 people worldwide. But I don't think it should be a crisis for the international system. When just 0.25% of the world's population is a refugee, it should not be beyond the capacity of the international community to ensure safety and dignity for those who flee, and to provide proper support to those who give them shelter. And that's where the Global Compact on Refugees comes in. The Compact is an important new tool that we have to enhance the ways in which the international community responds to large refugee situations. It was developed in the wake of the large and tragic movements of refugees into Europe in 2015 and 2016, which many saw as being emblematic of an international system that wasn't providing sufficient support to the small number of mostly developing countries who host the majority of the world's refugees. Following a multilateral process of policy development and negotiation, the Compact was overwhelmingly endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly in December 2018. It envisages a world where refugees live a life of independence and dignity, not stuck in camps and reliant on handouts, but supported to live, work, and study as members of their host communities during their time in exile. The Compact envisages that host countries and communities are not left to bear the vast majority of the costs, but receive the support that they need from the international community in recognition of this good that they are doing for the international community. It envisages a world where more refugees are able to find durable solutions in a third country, such as through resettlement, family reunification, and community sponsorship. And lastly, and perhaps most ambitiously, it calls for renewed efforts to establish the conditions in countries of origin that would enable refugees to return home someday in safety and in dignity. The Compact seeks to achieve this through enhanced international cooperation, the idea being that the countries and communities hosting large numbers of refugees can be supported in a manner that also expands the protection space and advances the search for solutions. To this end, the Compact calls for the engagement of a wide variety of stakeholders in refugee responses, from NGOs and faith-based organizations to the private sector, international financial institutions, and crucially, the refugees themselves. It also promotes the so-called triple nexus, where humanitarian, development, and peace actors better coordinate their efforts and try to break down the silos that has existed previously between their work. The Global Compact establishes a range of mechanisms to bring this about, the centerpiece of which is the Global Refugee Forum, which brings the international community together every 4 years to announce pledges and to consider ways to further enhance the sharing of burdens and responsibilities. After 3 years of implementation, good progress has been made, but there is still a lot left to be done. The recently released indicator report for the Global Compact concludes that bilateral aid to refugee situations is increasing. The number of actors involved in refugee responses is growing, and refugees' access to work and education is being enhanced. But the responses are not keeping pace with the needs, which are growing faster than the support required to address them. As a result, and in particular compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic, more than 2/3 of refugees now live in poverty. Durable solutions also are hard to come by. Only 1 in every 100 refugees found a solution in 2020, and UNHCR estimates that 1.4 million refugees are currently in urgent need of resettlement. I was recently commissioned alongside another consultant by 3 of the world's largest displacement-focused NGOs, the International Rescue Committee, the Danish Refugee Council, and the Norwegian Refugee Council, to look at what kind of difference the Global Compact is making in particular country contexts. The picture is mixed. In Uganda, the approach that the Compact advocates has been embraced and is showing positive signs, but further support from the international community is required. In Bangladesh, on the other hand, the government denies that the 1.1 million displaced Rohingya living within its borders are refugees, and so resists the application of the Compact and its promise of a dignified life in the community for the Rohingya. The Rohingya thus remain in camps in Cox's Bazar or increasingly in the purpose-built facility on the Bhasan Char Island in the Bay of Bengal, which is frequently subject to cyclones and tidal waves. Because of this positioning on the part of the government, other actors involved in the response, including the UN, donor representatives, and NGOs, rarely, if ever, use the Global Compact as a framework for their activities for advocacy in Bangladesh. In donor states, there is plenty of support and goodwill from those in the foreign affairs and international development communities, but not so much from those who work on domestic asylum policy. And in fact, throughout the research, we heard from government officials and NGOs telling us about how their governments were undermining the Compact by being constructive abroad, but obstructive at home. So where to from here? I believe that there is a very important role for the United States in ensuring that the Global Compact fulfills its promise. Historically, of course, the United States has played a leading role when it comes to refugee protection. It has traditionally provided the majority of refugee resettlement places available worldwide and has made the largest financial contributions to refugee responses. Importantly, the refugee issue has traditionally been the subject of bipartisan consensus in Washington. And whilst this bipartisan consensus has frayed in recent years, the new administration is seeking to return the United States to its traditional leadership role in the international refugee regime, including by making a range of forward-leaning pledges at the stock-taking meeting for the Global Compact in December, which Chair Menza and Commissioner Bhargava outlined. The setting of a refugee resettlement target of 125,000 reestablishes the United States as the leading resettlement country in the world, and the promise to develop a private sponsorship program that allows communities to welcome more refugees furthers this goal. Further support to development financing for refugee situations is also welcome, as well as pledges to support meaningful refugee participation and to support refugee self-reliance. But more can be done. One thing that is particularly needed is more creative refugee diplomacy, and the Rohingya situation would be an excellent place to start. Although the majority of Rohingya refugees are in Bangladesh, there are a further 150,000 of them elsewhere in the region, most notably in Malaysia. During the course of my research into the current situation in Bangladesh, I was pleasantly surprised to hear measured optimism from a number of players about the importance and the potential for a regional refugee response framework that brings together host governments, donor and resettlement states, NGOs and faith-based groups, think tanks, academia, and of course the Rohingya communities themselves. Such a framework could aim to more fairly distribute responsibilities and generate improved protection for the Rohingya in line with the Global Compact on refugees. Such a regional approach would need the buy-in of states in the region, and ASEAN would be an important forum in this regard, but the United States could also play an important role as it has done in Southeast Asia before, when the comprehensive plan of action for Indo-Chinese refugees led to the resettlement of more than 500,000 Vietnamese refugees in the wake of the war there. I'll close by emphasizing that it is also essential for a country like the United States to practice what it preaches when it comes to people seeking asylum at its own borders. Because developing countries facing much larger refugee pressures look to what is being done in the developed world for inspiration or otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wall. Both Rabbi Jacobs and you have provided quite a bit of information and generating a lot of questions here. Before I open with a question, let me remind the audience to ask your questions by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we're going to try to get to many of those as possible. Thank you for those that have already started asking questions. Well, you both have touched on a number of important areas in this newer global compact. And obviously coming about in 2018, there have been some recent pledges by the Biden administration following the UNHCR high-level meeting. And Mr. Wall, you addressed some of the areas that the U.S. should prioritize. In advance of the second Global Refugee Forum next year in 2023, are there specific commitments you'd like to see from the United States and other countries? And are there other countries in particular that you would like to see also join the United States to further the support for the compact and its goals? We can start with you, Mr. Wall.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the pledges that were made in December are certainly a very good start. And there are plans, as I understand it, for that resettlement number of 125,000 to be just a beginning and to increase as the years go on. And that would be certainly an excellent way to lead the way. I think one of the main goals that UNHCR has is not only to expand the total number of available resettlement places for refugees, but also to expand the number of countries that are running resettlement programs. At the moment, there are about 35 countries that have resettled refugees over the last decade. Because of COVID, that number has dipped in the last few years. But I think providing the kind of technical and capacity building support that other countries in the kind of the lower upper income bracket to be able to both commence and expand their own resettlement places would be an excellent opportunity. I think the community sponsorship pilot program is also very promising. That's something that your neighbors to the north in Canada have been doing with great success for many years. And so hopefully over the next 2 years, the pilot program itself might be successful enough that it might be able to be ramped up into a fully fledged scheme to allow communities to sponsor refugees into their communities. And that's something that in Canada, at least, and in other countries around the world has been embraced with gusto by religious communities who are able to sponsor refugees to arrive. So there are a number of ways. I think from a diplomatic perspective, there are specific initiatives like the one that I mentioned that could be considered. But there are also what is often referred to maybe a bit derogatorily as the missing middle of countries that probably could be doing more to support the international refugee regime. And so there are probably diplomatic initiatives that the United States could take as well to encourage countries that might need to do a little bit more to pull their weight, to encourage them to play a larger role in the international refugee regime as well.
You know, but another question that arises, and I think you both hit on this aspect, the domestic processes. You said, Mr. Wall, that not a lot of support has been seen on those. Obviously, the compact includes provisions related to the domestic processes, including protections for asylum seekers. What are some of the opportunities for governments and other stakeholders to better support asylum seekers, specifically pursuant to the GCR? From both your perspectives, that would be very much appreciated.
I might hand to Rabbi Jacobs. I'm sure he has much more experience and knowledge of the American system than I do.
First of all, I'll just say a word. The multi-religious council that I serve on with an amazing and distinguished and very diverse group of religious leaders. We're not there because of our great policy expertise in all refugee matters. We're there because we know the communities well, and we can raise a religious voice in support of the just treatment of refugees, asylum seekers throughout the world. But I would say, in particular with asylum seekers, it's particularly been painful for us here in the United States. And I think as we go forward, we simply have to be sure that the asylum hearing structure is expanded, that it's improved, more courts, more judges, more access to legal assistance has to be made available. And we see what happens when that is not in place. And pain compounds pain compounds pain. And that is not necessarily in any way a necessity of the experience of asylum seekers, especially, we would say, in a country with the noble history and set of ideals that the United States has.
Mr. Wall, did you have anything else to add to that?
No, I don't think I could say anything more as eloquent as that.
Yes, indeed. No, thank you. Thank you for that. Before we turn to the audience, I want to turn to our chair, Nadine Mienza, and Commissioner Anarima Bargava. If they would like to ask a question or make a comment at this time. We'll start with Chair Mienza.
First of all, thanks to both of you for that excellent presentation. I took a lot of notes. I always appreciate hearing from those of you that really work in this field and are able to communicate to us the situation, so we're better able to make recommendations and follow our mandate. In my own experience, in the last few years, I've met numerous Iraqi refugees in Lebanon, and then we talked about the heavy burden they have with refugees, as well as Jordan, who fled genocide 7 years ago, yet they don't have UN protection or support. They're not able to legally work. Their children have not been able to go to school all these years. And so I know the UN gives recognition because of deals, and different countries have different relationships. So I understand that part of it, but clearly there's an imbalance with the way that refugees are treated depending on what country they come from. Is there any chance the global compact has an impact on correcting this imbalance? And if not, what's a way forward for these vulnerable communities? I guess, Mr. Walls, have you run into this one before? I know with you dealing with the UNHCR.
For sure. I mean, it's a very difficult question, and there are many kind of competing factors, and unfortunately, the refugee system and everything that goes around it is almost inherently political, and so political considerations come in so often. One bright spot on the horizon that I would point to, though, is the increasing involvement of organizations like the World Bank, which, rather than committing funds and providing support of all kinds on the basis of political interests, which most of the, for example, the funding for UNHCR comes mostly from donor governments, and those governments often attach conditions and earmark funds and would like them to see them be used in particular ways. The way that the World Bank operates is much more on a needs-based model and is able to use a much more objective criteria in the way that they approach some of these questions. That's not to say, of course, that UNHCR just does whatever the donors ask of it, but the donors are ultimately able to direct their funding in the way that they would like. And so the instigation or the growth of the role of the World Bank in refugee responses that is able to take a much more objective and facts-based and needs-based approach to the way that it addresses refugee situations, I think is a bright spot on the horizon that could lead to more equitable treatment, because it's certainly the case that refugees receive vastly different treatment depending on what country they're from and what country they're currently in.
Thanks for that. Appreciate it.
Rabbi Jacobs, did you want to jump in? I noticed you earlier.
Yeah, I would just, first of all, thank you to Mr. Wall for not only that clear answer, but all of his presentation. It's hugely important for all of us to better understand. I think one of the things as you lay out how urgent the need is. I think particularly, I would say here in the United States, for us to understand the moral crisis that this is, right? Sometimes we tend to kind of put a circle around our kind of domestic issues and, to say, well, the rest of the world, let other people worry about it. And not to suggest that we have, the answer to everything that ails, but for us to feel that pain of that refugee and to understand that there's so many different causes for refugees in the world. But the idea, I think particularly in almost all the faith traditions that I know and I see in some of the questions that have already been posed in the Q&A, that our traditions may differ in so many areas, in religious texts and in some of our modes of prayer and observance, but on the place of the refugee, the other, the migrant, the stranger, there is common teaching that this is one of the central obligations of a religious life. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to talk about this also as a matter of religious freedom and as a matter of moral urgency. So I think the policy issue is very, very important. But I do think that more and more for religious voices to be raised, not to take issue with other religious faiths, but to raise a common voice of deep concern is not the answer, but it is a piece of the answer.
Thank you. Commissioner Bargava.
Thank you, Dwight. Rabbi Jacobs, that was a wonderful segue into the question I wanted to ask, and of which there are many. But I wanted to ask you both about two things. One is, it is very difficult, given the overwhelming number of refugees around the world, to think about how to prioritize. And I wanted to get your sense of how to think about that. And you spoke eloquently to it right now about how to actually, in that context of our feeling of our borders are being flooded, right, whether in the United States or other parts of the world, how to really make the moral and other argument for religious refugees at this time. And the second question, which is a little bit more technical, but I wanted to speak to it, which is, when we think about the Rohingya, most people think about Cox's Bazar or Bhasan Char, and the Rohingya Muslims and Hindus and Christians who are in those camps. I also want to just raise those who are internally displaced, and certainly there are internally displaced refugees, Rohingyas in Burma. How do we think about those who are internally displaced in countries where some of the ways in which we might want to assist become even more complicated? So I wanted to just put that more technical question out there too.
Should I volunteer?
Yes, please.
Some very challenging questions from both of you. I think in terms of the question of how to prioritize and that kind of thing, I think it is very difficult. I think when there is a temptation to think that there are refugees flooding in and there's been a loss of borders and what have you, I think it's always important to remember that that for countries like the United States or Australia, where I'm from, there is often a rhetoric around refugees flooding across the border that doesn't really meet with the reality in terms of sheer numbers and in terms of the capacity of the society to absorb those people. I think it's important to remember that 80, as I said, the refugees are remaining in developing countries. And in fact, 73% of the world's refugees only ever cross one border. They're fleeing persecution, whether it's religious persecution or some other, or civil conflict or what have you. And they only cross one border. They cross one border to move into the next country. They stay there for as long as they have to and move back. And so it's important, I think, to keep a perspective on where the real numbers of the world's refugees are. And the majority of them are staying very close to home because they want to go back. They don't want to leave forever. They want to go back to where they're from because of that kind of connection to home and to place that we all feel, I suppose. And yes, when it comes to IDPs, it's an even more complicated situation because obviously you often have the source of the persecution is also the same as the country where the people have fled to and haven't crossed a border, and so there are issues of sovereignty and challenges in the way that the current international regime is established to meet those challenges, and that's something that the international community still has to work through, because we do have quite a well-established system for the protection of refugees, lasting, way back to the end of the Second World War, and supplemented most recently by the Global Compact. But in terms of IDPs, the system is much less advanced, and the ability of the international community to step in and to support those displaced communities depends very much on the goodwill of the government that often is the source of the persecution, or at least sometimes complicit in that persecution. And so there really is a major challenge there that more work needs to be done on.
I would just add, thank you for that answer, as well as the others. I think that, even thinking about this in terms of priorities, there just has become this global rhetoric of demonization of refugees that is corrosive, and it affects every part of this experience. And I think, to be honest, unfortunately, some of that has emanated from the United States. And for us to be able to understand that refugees, they most, as you just beautifully shared, cross one border, hope one day to go back home, but they also bring enormous value to the societies in which they live. They contribute to, they're not, taking away from. And I think for us to kind of reestablish some of the actual truths of the experience is really necessary. We also see that some of the harms that we see are interconnecting, right? The children, women, particularly vulnerable in certain settings, and then policies that separate families. We know some things that are basically true about being able to help people through crisis, and again, to really affirm those, I think would give us more strength globally. But it has to start with living that out in a very tangible way where we are.
Thank you very much. I'm now turning to the audience questions. We have several. We'll try to get to as many as we can. I'll give Mr. Wall and Rabbi Jacobs a break for a second. We had a couple of questions come at USCIRF, at wondering, could USCIRF speak to the many refugee communities from Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, and other, especially indigenous communities? I think Commissioner Bhargava, are you able to respond to that? I want to have a sense of these other communities, because some of the other refugees from various countries get more attention. How about these in particular, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, and indigenous communities?
Sure. I think that part of the importance of just understanding the complexity of those who are refugees around the world, and that is critically important. And I would just welcome the information on refugee communities, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, and other indigenous religious communities, because I think it's really important for us to continue to highlight that. And so please send that along. And we are certainly aware of many of those religious communities that are, that have been displaced and pushed out of their homelands as well. So thank you for that question, and please send that information to us.
Great, thank you. There's a specific question here on now, how does the United States government protect refugees fleeing religious persecution in Russia, specifically Jehovah's Witnesses and Russian-occupied Crimean Tatars? Can either of you or any of the panelists respond to that, a sense of the U.S. role, or any other governments that you might be aware of in this context?
Can I just say something small? There'll be bigger policy insights, I'm sure, but there can't be exceptions as to whose religious freedom and whose human rights we're going to, to stand up for. So when we, look around the world and we say, oh, these are really serious, those, though life-threatening or not, I think we betray our own prejudices. So I just think the question is important. To highlight that this is not to basically protect the religious freedom and the very humanity and well-being of people we know or have deep relationship with or feel sympathy. It's broader, it's more inclusive. And I think, to me, that's at the heart of the question.
Thank you. You often hear it characterized as the most vulnerable, of course, but that could have many levels. So I appreciate your comments there. There's another question about how can could someone please address the preventive measures so that people are not forced to be refugees in the first place from the perspective of the UN Global Compact? Is this something, Mr. Wall, that you might be able to respond to in terms of preventive measures? Are there some in place before it gets to that, or is that just something that we don't have much room to prevent things?
Thank you. Yes, the compact does talk about prevention and addressing root causes of large movements of refugees. Of course, religious persecution is specifically mentioned there as one of those. This has been an area, though, that has been particularly challenging. I mentioned during my remarks what's called the humanitarian development peace nexus, or the triple nexus, which aims to bring together those in the humanitarian development and peace communities to work a little bit better in forced displacement and in other situations. And whilst the relationship between the humanitarian and the development communities is starting to improve, it's still taking a while to really work out and think through how we integrate that peace element. And the refugee regime, of course, itself is designed to respond to refugee situations rather than necessarily to prevent refugee situations. But I think that there is a growing awareness that there is a role there for the refugee regime also to look at prevention and to look at addressing some of these issues. But it goes well beyond the refugee regime itself. It goes to human rights. It goes to the protection of fundamental freedoms and liberties. It goes to a broad range of other questions involving issues indeed of climate change and economic development in some situations, pure religious persecution in others. It goes to a wide range of issues, but there is a role there for the Global Compact to play, I think. It's only at the very beginnings of starting to think through what exactly that means, but I think that is something that should indeed be more of a focus in the years to come. And there is a hook there for the Global Compact to be not the whole answer by any means, but at least part of the answer to what is a very difficult question.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think this one is probably more directed to Rabbi Jacobs. Very practical. What are some practical ways private individuals and faith-based organizations could help at the moment, right now? You mentioned your role on that council and working with a lot of these faith-based groups. Are there some specific things you can point to for those that might be willing to help?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think there are very real things for us to do. And I think I'll start locally in the United States for our faith-based communities, to make clear that part of the mission, and I would say a large part of the mission of a religious community, whether it's a church, a mosque, or a synagogue, or a temple in a community, is to do this work locally, to embrace, to at times house, to advocate for. And when that is part of one's liturgy, it's part of one's textual study, it's part of a community's activism, and that then radiates outward. So that if we have this experience locally, this is what we do, then our faith-based organizations in other parts of the globe, they obviously are extensions of that. So I think we need to, bring it close to home, live it out. I just, an example, I remember one of the last, before the ban a few years back, was our synagogue in Chicago, Am Shalom. And here's a Reform Jewish synagogue welcoming Syrian Muslim family. And it was the most, honestly, it was the most transformative experience for the temple, as I hope it was for the Syrian Muslim family. It built a new sense of what religious life is about, and built bridges and changed how people thought of the other, and opened hearts and open minds. And that also opened the commitment to do the work more globally. And I can't emphasize enough that the work that we do has to unlock, the chains sometimes around our hearts that we've built to kind of wall off so many people who they should be part of our family, the way we think about the world. So I would give that as maybe a way to practice locally and be inspired by that experience to go more globally.
Thank you very much. Couple of questions related to, Rohingya in Bangladesh. And I know, Mr. Wall, you mentioned earlier, as far as your policy recommendations, that would be a good place to start the role that the U.S. and other governments could play. The question really gets to saying the previous administration here in the United States apparently stopped the process of asylum seekers in the U.S. and the current Biden administration has also not done a lot yet. What's the prospects there? In terms of, if you could go a little deeper on your recommendation there about how to address some things. If it's a good place to start, what are some of the things that can be done to help push this forward?
Sure. I suppose one of the major issues is that the government of Bangladesh is not willing to allow Rohingya to be resettled into countries like the United States or other developed resettlement countries, because they aren't convinced that it's going to make much of a difference to the plight that the Bangladeshis are facing in hosting the refugees. And so I think what you saw, for example, in the comprehensive plan of action in the 1980s that I mentioned during my remarks, was that you had a broad-based diplomatic initiative of major resettlement countries that came together and made firm commitments to those countries that were hosting large numbers of Vietnamese refugees to say, yes, we are going to step up. We commit that we will help you relieve this burden. It won't be a token number of a few hundred refugees, but it will be a large-scale resettlement that is going to significantly lift the burden that you face and improve the lives of these refugees. There were other elements to it as well, but that was the core of the resettlement agreement that was reached. And so I think if you had an initiative where the United States and other countries were willing to come together and to say to the government of Bangladesh, we are willing to engage in large-scale resettlement of Rohingya refugees who would like to be resettled. I think that is something that could really make a game-changing effort to the situation of the Rohingya in Bangladesh. And I think more broadly, as I said, throughout the region, I think taking a regional approach where the countries of the region as well, those who are hosting Rohingya refugees outside of Bangladesh, are also willing to step up to the table and say that they will contribute also to enhancing the protection that the Rohingya are able to receive, then that likewise would also relieve that pressure and result in improved outcomes ultimately for the refugees.
Thank you very much. I know we're up against our time. I wanted to squeeze in one more question, a question about community sponsorship. Is there any response to the question, can an individual provide more information? Can one of the panelists provide information whether a community can sponsor an individual who is outside the United States? For example, with Afghanistan, can a community sponsor an Afghan who is outside and has not yet traveled to the United States, right? I think we know the answer to that.
Yeah,
but
we know the
anyone,
answer.
do you want to respond, Chair Manza?
Sure. This is a disappointment to us because the private partnership we were hoping would be that people could sponsor Afghans or refugees in general to come, and then their community would put the funds together, support them, go through the whole process. And unfortunately, at this moment in time, it's limited to the Afghans that are on the bases that they could work with. So we're hoping that they expand that, but currently the folks that are outside of the country aren't included in this program.
Thank you for clarifying that. I wanted to thank our panelists and ask if either Chair Manza or Commissioner Bhargava had any final words before we wrap up.
I just want to say thank you, first of all, to both of you guests for just providing such important information, and especially appreciate your heart for the refugee, for those folks that are the most vulnerable in the world. And, the lack of equity among them, is long really challenged us. And so these conversations give us an opportunity to take a look. Hopefully we have people on the Hill and in the administration listening and rethinking how they approach this vulnerable community. How can we better work together? So thank you again for being a part of it. I appreciate it.
I just want to add thank you not only to our panelists, but also to all who joined us today. And please send us information about religious communities that are being persecuted around the world, because it's really helpful as we continue to try and press for as much attention that can be paid, and different ways in which we can support refugees being able to thrive and hopefully, of course, get back to their homelands. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks again. And I want to reiterate our thanks to Chair Manza and Commissioner Bargava for leading this important and timely conversation on the Global Compact, and our distinguished panelists, Rabbi Jacobs and Mr. Patrick Wall, for sharing their very helpful expertise and insights this morning. I also want to thank Elizabeth Cassidy, our Director of Research and Policy at USCIRF, Kirsten Lavery, USCIRF's Supervisory Policy Analyst, and Danielle Ashbayan, USCIRF's Supervisory Public Affairs Officer, for their contributions on today's event as well. To learn more about USCIRF's work, I encourage you to visit our website at www.uscirf.gov. Of course, you can also contact us through our website and provide that information that Commissioner Bargava was referring to. We have an open door and would very much welcome any information that you're able to share with us. We're very much looking forward to hosting similar conversations on other countries, issues, thematic issues as well, in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you again for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time on USCIRF Conversations. Have a good day.